Buenos! Welcome to another edition of the SQL Data Partners Podcast. I am Carlos El Chacon, your host, and I am joined today by Mr. Kevin Fiesel.
Hello.
Mr. Eugene Meininger is excused. He's out valliganting the countryside somewhere. So today we want to do a little, a little public service announcement and hash over, talk, reassess, revisit a topic that might be a little bit painful, but I think is still important, and that is the cumulative update. And so that is going to be our topic today. Our show notes are going to be available at sqldatapartners.com/patching or at sqldatapartners.com/252. Before we get into that, I do have a couple of shout outs that I want to mention. We've got Chuck Jacobson, Gregory Celentano, Marcel Thompson, Madonna Calvati, Hamad Goffrey, Michael Thurber, Maria M.F., Susan N. Brooks, Edwin Side, Emmanuel Mong, Sandra Wax, Patricia Griswold, Tim Delano, Stephanie Casey Richards, Jocelyn Baladeris, David Snyder, Christy Shadbolt, John Morell, Paul J. Tiernan, Suzanne Hess, Samad Al-Dualmani, and last but not least, Nigel Foxnock. He actually said that he talked about episode 250 being the round number, and he said, like Kevin, that episode 256 is the one he's interested in. That's the round number that he'd like to see.
It's true.
I suppose I can. We have been tossing about some ideas for episode 256. And I guess I can say that we are looking to do a community edition.
Yeah. So basically, we're gonna put Carlos in a dunk tank, and for every super chat of $10 or more, someone's gonna throw a ball and dunk them. So get those super chats in. But oh wait, that's the wrong show.
Yeah. Although that's now my team has some ideas. I wonder why this dunk tank is in the Amazon cart. Okay, so again, we talked about this being a bit of a public service announcement. I do want to call attention, going all the way back to episode 112, October 2017, with the late Robert Davis. So he has some interesting ideas that we need to suggest. Now, of course, back then we still called them cumulative updates. No, I'm sorry. Oh man, I totally botched that. I've been practicing. We totally were calling them service packs, but now we've gotten into the cumulative update model. But anyway, it's worth. He's going to go. He has some different takes on some things, and so it's worth re-listening if you haven't. If you're interested in that topic or want to dive deeper and hit it up, that will be worthy of a re-listen.
So what's the easy way to get to that episode?
So the easiest way is probably go to our podcast or our website rather. Go to the website, search for patching, and it will come up, right? Episode 112. Some in the podcast players, sometimes it's going to vary by what type of player you have as to how easy it is to search the old episodes, but
that's fair. So I'm playing the role of Carlos today. Hello, everybody. My name is Carlos El Chacon. Hello, Canyoneros and whatnot. But there's a lot about patching, and in fairness, cumulative updates were around prior to the drop of the service pack world. We just tended to focus on service packs instead because that meant, I only have to update once a quarter instead of every month. But now we're updating every month, and sometimes those updates are really, really important, as in get it in right now. Sometimes those updates are really, really important, as in don't do that because it's going to break your system. Because, hey, that has happened with people where there have been there's at least one CU that was pulled for 2019 that it was CU7 where it caused some major problems, and Microsoft had to pull that one and re-release it in CU8. But let's talk a little bit about what it takes to be patched. And what our options are here. So, Carlos, what have we got?
Yeah, so one of the challenges is, as you mentioned, keeping up with it, um, but then also knowing when to put them in. So Microsoft officially has three ways that they want to keep you um, in sync, right? So the Microsoft Update, right, MU, which is really tied to, I feel like, the Windows Software Update Service,
It
right?
is.
Or yeah, the WSUS, right? So those two, they're listed separately, but they're really, the same thing. So if you have
So
yeah, go ahead.
yeah, no, they are pretty similar. The area where I would point out the difference is that the Microsoft Update, think of that more like desktop users. I
Yeah,
have just a desktop with SQL Server installed. Hey, SQL Server should still be patched on your desktop machine. If you're running RTM on your desktop and CU16 on production, then you may see a difference. You might see some problems on desktop that you're not seeing in production, or vice versa.
sure. Or a way to get in, right? That you don't want people to have. Um, yeah, so the Windows Update is nice. They have started pushing more through there. It used to be, or I felt like sometimes the cumulative updates wouldn't get in there unless they were security focused.
Mm.
Um, but that may be just my memory, right? The old man disease there. Yeah, so the Windows Updates one, right? We talked about SUS, WSUS. But then that requires some additional components, right? You have to have a WSUS server and some of that connectivity. And generally, that's going to be, at least I have found that that's going to be a bit more in your so the infrastructure folks are going to be the ones that are going to want to manage those pieces, right? They're also the ones that are responsible for your Windows patching, right? So a lot of this might depend on where the responsibility for patching what lies. There's still plenty of organizations, in fact, like for our managed services customers, right? The infrastructure team is responsible for the OS patches, but we manage the SQL Server patches. Some organizations, right? One group's going to take care of all of it, and so yeah, depending on how you decide to do that, your experience might vary. Um, and then they mentioned the Microsoft Download Center, which is really not, in my mind, not a way, but really that's how you go get the patch. Um, so in terms of Microsoft making those available, those are kind of the two ways, right? So the update, right, and then WSUS. If you want to then break out of that, you are then creating your own, right? This is choose your own patching structure in terms of how you want to go about doing that. So again, kind of mentioning back episode 112, Robert talks about some automation pieces that he's seen, and introduces. Um, Admittedly, I'm a little more vanilla there, uh, mostly because so downtime, right? Downtime is something that we have to manage, and not that we can't. I guess as I say that, there are still automation pieces, but I still feel like I'm fairly intentional about patching the servers instead of letting some process be like, oh, there's a new update, go ahead and send it on. Does that make sense?
So when you're saying intentional, are you talking about test and dev first and then promote the patches, or are you talking about intentional in some other fashion?
Well, yeah, so I think both. There are two components there. So one, I want to ensure the order is correct. I don't want to patch dev and production in the same weekend, ideally, right? If I can get ahead of those. Again, but this goes into my structure or my process of how I want that patching to occur. But the other piece of it is that I also want to know that, hey, we are going to patch this weekend instead of every Saturday at whatever 2 a.m. I'm going to have a process that just wakes up and says, hey, is there a patch? Let me install it. Right? I want to be the gatekeeper and at least say, oh, this is happening. And then again, whatever automation pieces I have, For example, one that we've started using is the DBA tools. Folks have put out an update command, the update DBA instance. So that gives me some ability to do some of that automation, but I still feel like I am pressing the proverbial button, if you will, in terms of when the patch goes out.
That makes sense. What characteristics or what considerations are important for you before you push that button? For example, do you read the patch notes? Is this something that you say, well, for customer A, the CU17 has these notes and these things that have changed, and maybe I'll apply it to them. But this customer, they don't really use those tools. Or is that something that you actively do, or do you just say, well, new update, let me push it to dev, let's see how it works?
So in dev, I'm much more liberal, right? A lot of times I do just want to kind of get it out, and because again, the recovery, our RTO is a little bit longer, right? We generally speaking. Now I will go through the notes because you do want it, particularly in those instances where I know availability groups was one that had some bumps. Replication, again, you just want to take a peek and see if it's going to be affected. Is another area. We're not really doing so much with mirroring anymore. I'm trying to think what are the other hot button services that might be there. But if I know that a customer is using a certain service, I'll at least want to scan to be like, okay, is this getting touched in this update?
And for people who aren't aware of this, Microsoft does include patch notes. The patch notes can be hit or miss. In many cases, if it's security related, they tend to be very vague about it. If it's performance related, they'll be a little more explicit. But even so, it may feel a little frustrating when you open up a patch note that says something. So, for example, there's one note in here. I'm just looking at CU17 for SQL Server 2019 that creating edge constraints on graph tables meets an access violation when you use a node table instead of an edge table in the constraint. And that's the summary. There is also a link to the specific support topic sometimes. In this particular case, it looks like there is not a separate support topic. So it's just a link to the bookmark. And you might be able to, with that amount of information, know exactly what they're talking about. But in other cases, well, it may not be enough. In other cases, they'll put out an actual KB article, a knowledge base article that, as an example, here's a KB for an access violation dump file occurring during column store index scan. And will give you just a little bit of information about the problem. In this particular case, it's essentially not informative. It just tells you that an access violation dump file is generated, and it tells you the function in SQL Server that generates it. It's a deep copy row. But basically, their resolution is go install the latest update. Sometimes they'll give you a bit more information, and many times it's kind of at that level. And
yeah, that's right. And I think so. You're just trying to be as educated as possible. But admittedly, right? I'm sure Kevin probably reads those notes a bit more than some of the rest of us might. I'm looking for highlights. I really just like the cliff notes, right? Once it goes into a lot of unless I guess the variation is, for example, you just mentioned the graph database. Now all of a sudden, if I have a customer using graph database, okay, now I have to dig in deeper, right? Because I know that I'm going to be affecting them. That kind of thing.
right,
It's also nice when, again, you can get into the devs and we have just lots of environments to play around with. You can start getting comfortable with those patches and again, just getting touches. I know that doesn't, for a lot of folks, that doesn't work. And for a lot of you, unfortunately, I shouldn't say a lot. There are more people than you might think still only have a production environment. Like that's it, SQL Server, and that's it. And so that can be a challenge. Again, one of the, I guess the nice thing there is you are kind of leaning on the community a little bit there in terms of other experiences, or the experiences others have had. And obviously, if you have somebody that you can reach out to and say, "Hey, have you got any problems with this patch?" Right, could be beneficial. But again, generally those people are lagging a little bit, right? Because they're like, "Okay, I need everybody else to go fight this fight," and unless it's security related, I'm going to be, they tend to hold off, which again I think is okay as long as you are at least keeping up some rhythm, right? The challenge, as always, is that you let it go by and you blink a couple of times, and a year or two has passed, and you haven't gotten any of those cumulative updates. And I think that's where folks start running into problems.
Right, especially if you're using a slightly older version of SQL Server.
Right.
2019, mainstream support is still active through 2025. But if you're using, say, SQL Server 2017, then if I remember right, there's a support ending date for certain CUs. And actually, I'm looking at 2017 and it doesn't look like there is that support end date. For prior versions, for 2016 and before, you had to be on the latest service pack for them to support you. So, for example, 2016 is still supported through 2020 through the year 2026 if you're on SP3. If you're on SP2, support ends October 11th of 2022. It ends this year in about 2 months. If you're not on the latest service pack for SQL Server 2016. That is an important thing to keep in mind. The CU system looks like it's a little bit different. They haven't at least had any caps so far that I'm aware of, well, you must be on at least CU 15 or CU 20 or whatever to get support. I would not be shocked if that happens in the future. But I do have a couple of questions that are related, and they're tying to patch promotion, as in going from a dev environment into a prod environment. And the first one is, when you're working with your customers, do you have any sort of consistent process between customers to say, these are the things that we're going to check for after a release of a new CU, and we'll do that in dev, and if everything looks good, then we promote it? Are there specific activities you're looking for or things you're looking to find that are general to everybody, or is it really a case-by-case basis based on the customer? Asking the hard questions.
Yeah, our general process is consistent across everyone until you need an exception, right? So we try to maintain a central process. So again, for example, because now we're using the DBA tools. DBA tools allows you to put the patches in a single, in a shared repository, and then I push the patch out to dev. I want to generally allow for a week at a minimum to let that patch sit. I'm running through jobs, right? What are the, am I getting enough traction in my dev environment that I feel like I'm touching the high points or the areas that I think might be problematic? And then once I feel comfortable with that, and this is where I'm communicating. In this case, I'm communicating back with the customer and saying, let's just use that graph database as an example. Hey, this patch is going to touch GraphDB. Hey, can we do something in dev this week and run through a couple of cycles on that, right? Is there a deployment that we need to do, or right? Can we get QA in there just to touch it, right? Make sure that they feel comfortable, with what's going on. So that is kind of, I guess that's the structure. Give yourself some time, communicate that. Because you've looked at the highlights anyway, what are the areas that I think might need to be touched? Try to communicate that, ask them to take a peek, and then at least or in theory, right, you have tried to do some due diligence to simulate what could happen in production. and so you won't have any unexpected errors.
All right. And you mentioned already, let's have it percolate for a week. Let's see if anything does come up. My follow-up question is, you're having this patch sit for a week. Are you waiting for a patch to have already sat for a certain amount of time before introducing it to a dev environment? Or do you see the update and say, well, CU 17 is out today, or CU 19 is out today, or whatever, let's start patching?
Yeah, so we don't necessarily wait. However, we do have a patching schedule, right? So it is we're normally looking at it every other week. Hey, is there something new? What do we need to deploy? Right? So if something came out yesterday and we're ready to start patching dev, then we're going to include it in the mix, right? But it might have also come out 2 weeks ago. So we're trying to keep that cadence of, okay, well, today's our day. We're going to go out, take a look. Is there something we need to patch? Put it into the process. Start the communication process. That's really more of the how you get started versus, oh, hey, I see Microsoft just released this thing. Let's wait for a week to see what happens.
Yeah, and I think both of those are certainly valid strategies. I think the smaller the organization is, the better it is to wait a little bit of time. The larger organizations, especially where things are automated, yeah, you can push out these patches, and if something fails, find a way to roll it back. But when you're a smaller one-person organization with several SQL Server instances, you may not necessarily have the desire to be the front line of bug testing, and just let other people figure out if there's a major issue. Now, suppose there is a major issue. You've deployed out some changes to dev and disaster hits. Let's say not the worst kind of disaster. We haven't had disk corruption or the database is just toast. Let's say major bug is introduced, makes it so that the application is either unworkable or that there's a significant problem. What's the rollback strategy?
Yeah, so luckily, Microsoft has gotten better about introducing or giving you the ability to see the patches that have been installed. And so normally we're just going in there because again, we know what has been installed, and then we're just uninstalling that patch. I will say that normally it is going to be very specific, and obviously there's exceptions, but it feels like to me that more and more we're not necessarily seeing like major issues in a la, right, the server is no longer available, but it's these little niche issues, again, that what am I trying to patch? Again, we're kind of using the graph database, right? Now all of a sudden I have these node tables and there's some weirdness around the nodes, right? And again, that's with us not rereading, all the nodes. And so the rest of the system is quote unquote fine, right? It's just this particular issue. So again, sometimes you then get to decide, well, is this a quote unquote problem, right? Or can I let this lie in dev, right? Because we're not developing on that, or what have you. The way our cycle is working at the moment, that we'll just let that be, try out the other pieces, kind of put that in as a known issue, and then wait to see, right, in a week if the community comes back and Microsoft says, "Oops, right, here's really the CU that you need," kind of a thing.
Right. Yeah, that's a difficult problem to deal with, and I do have specific examples. CU2 of 2019 broke Polybase, where prior to 2019, you could use Windows authentication to access resources and to set up external tables and to query from external tables. CU2 broke it to the point where I think it was a severity level 21, which killed your session. Didn't kill the server. So I forget if it was 21 or if it was 20, but it didn't kill the instance. It did kill your session. You had to reconnect.
Right.
And you could only use SQL authentication to work with external objects. Later, they broke it so that it wouldn't, or they broke it. They unbroke it to the extent that it would not give you that severe of an issue when trying to use Windows authentication. It just would fail. So you could still continue the session. You just couldn't do the thing that you were able to do.
Right.
Yeah. So that kind of stuff does happen, and for quite a while, actually, probably is still the case. I gave up on it a few CUs back. I could try again to see if it's still broken, but it probably is. And at that point, you just have to realize, well, we can't go forward with Windows authentication and Polybase external tables because we'd have to go back to RTM on 2019, and there's a lot of bug fixes in 2019. So there is that trade-off, like you mentioned.
Right. Yeah, that's right. So that's where you get to the case-by-case basis, right? Of is this a problem for me, right? If you're Kevin Fiesel, right, Polybase has an issue, that's a big problem.
It's a big deal.
It's a big deal, right? Now, I don't know if I should be bowing my head in shame or not, right? But for most of our customers, Polybase, no problem, right?
That's pretty much everybody.
Yeah. So
but look,
again,
there are dozens of people who use Polybase. There are dozens of us.
Yeah. Yeah. So
all right, at this point, anything else you want to cover or anything that I've missed in this interrogation?
So again, because we have a great community, in my mind, so the easy button, and maybe you like going to the Windows Download Center or the the download catalog. Part of the challenge that I have with it is that so I'm not generally thinking about OS patches or right. You've got SCOM or all these other things that Microsoft sells, and all the patches are in there. And I'm like, I really only care about SQL Server. I guess that's just the kind of guy that I am. And so I think it's still Brent. He started it. Oh yes, yeah, it's still Brent at the bottom.
Yeah, SQLServerUpdate.com.
Yeah, so SQLServerUpdates.com. It's just
with an S at the end.
With an S. It's just super succinct. I mean, it's a grid. There's my version. What's the most recent? When did it come out? And there's a link to the other ones. And you click on that. Like the link to the other ones. There. It is. Here's when it came out. And he did actually add its support date date end for those other for the older versions. And so again, as a knuckle dragging Neanderthal that I am, right? I just have found that my go-to on the regular cadence, whatever that cadence is, right? And I know I mentioned every 2 weeks, right? I mean, it could be a month, it could be longer than that. I won't blame you. Generally speaking, of the security ones, Microsoft is going to make a bit more noise about. So hopefully they come up on your radar. So whatever, but even if it's just an Outlook calendar reminder, I know that might be, the Outlook calendar can be sacrosanct to some folks, but whatever that cadence is, just to remind you to get in there and take a peek, it can be helpful.
Yeah, definitely. And also, you can set up meetings so that people don't bother you because you're in a patching meeting. It may just be with yourself, but it's pro tips.
But that way, when you're talking out loud or yelling at the computer, right, people will think, oh, well, he's in a meeting, right? But you're not talking to yourself, you're having a meeting.
So I always carry a cell phone with me. That way, nobody knows.
You're never quite sure. Yeah. Okay, so I think that's going to do it for today's compañeros. Thank you, Mr. Kevin, for helping us guide us through there. If you have other thoughts, I know we mentioned the DBA tools. So let's see. All of a sudden, I always have to look it up. So the update DBA instance might be a way for you to take a peek. And there is some weirdness, not weirdness, right? But because patching, right? DBA tools has to keep up with the patches as well. So there is a little bit of syncing issue. So you have to kind of update that on a regular basis if you want to go the DBA tools route. But a nifty way to get started if you need something that you kind of want to automate something, but don't want to spend a lot of money. So, okay, Mr. Kevin, if folks want to get in touch with you, how might they do so?
Well, Microsoft put my contact information in a system table, but then they took it out in CU7 of SQL Server 2019, so it's gone.
Man, we'll have to wait for the next CU for that one then. Yeah. Compañeros, you can reach out to me on LinkedIn. I am Carlos L. Chacon. Thanks for tuning in today. If you have ideas or topics that you think we should be talking about, let me know. If you've listened this far to the end of the episode, you must be a true compañero. Take a peek at SQLDataPartners.com/t-shirt to get your very own SQL Data Partners Podcast t-shirt. Thanks for joining us. Thanks for joining us, everyone. And we'll see you on the SQL Trail. Bye now.
SQL Data Partners.